Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha patitanam pavnebhyo vaishnavibhyo namo namaha. Hare Krishna, I'd like to welcome all the devotees and the viewers who are joining us for this discussion on a very important topic for ISKCON, the reading of Srila Prabhupada's books every day. Its contribution to our personal, individual spiritual life, and exploring how and what it contributes to ISKCON as an institution and its growth in the coming thousands of years. For our discussion today, we have the privilege and honor of welcoming His Grace Nrsimhananda Prabhu. Nrsimhananda Prabhu is an initiated disciple of Srila Prabhupada. Many of us are acquainted with Prabhu through the fame of ISKCON TV and the many productions that he brought to life, like that of Vrindavan, Mayapur, and inspired all of us in our Krishna Bhakti. Prabhu currently also serves as a chairperson of Sabha, a body of senior devotees within ISKCON who perform a very important role for the GBC body. Nrsimhananda Prabhu, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Mr. Prabhu, it's my honor. Vanchakalpa tiruscha kripasindhuvevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavyo namo namaha.
Nrsimhananda Prabhu, as a person who's been engaged in creative work, in writing, scripting, producing, directing, how has Srila Prabhupada's books contributed to the development of the work that you do every day?
Well, that's almost a rhetorical question. You know, everything that we do is based on our understanding of what Srila Prabhupada taught in his books. So, you know, I wouldn't have been motivated to get involved in any of the processes or services without having been enlightened and inspired by Srila Prabhupada's, from hearing from Srila Prabhupada, because there's a distinction that we make between reading and hearing. But in fact, reading, if you think about it, is just a subtle form of Shravanam. You know, what's the difference if I sit at the feet of Srila Prabhupada, either in his Vapu or just from his Vani and in a video or audio, and hear those words? And, you know, between that and sitting down and reading, is there a qualitative difference that, you know, is true for every person? And is that difference actually manifest as, you know, better for some and others hearing from on the more subtle plane? Is it better for them? It's a really interesting question that we've never really asked or researched in, you know, in these 50 years that since Prabhupada has departed.
What has your realization been on this question?
You know, I'm a person who is drawn to the visual media long before I became a devotee. And it was interesting that my first year in Krishna consciousness was working, part of that year was working on Tiffany Street in Brooklyn at the ISKCON Press, and where we actually produced the books, we printed the books. And we were printing the Bhagavatam in small segments. And every time we printed something, we were always anxious to read it and to, you know, share it with one another because it was fresh off the press. We were seeing it before practically anyone else. So it was a very exciting time. But what was so attractive to me about those days and those books were the beautiful artwork on the covers of those small book Bhagavatam mini books. And that drew me in. It drew me in. It was like provided a narrative, a visual narrative. And because I'm very oriented visually, to me, that was almost a precursor to reading the books. And even when I first came in contact with a devotee, it was in the Tottenham Road Court Station in London, and I was rushing to my film school, and Mataji was distributing back to Godheads, so I was leaving town in a couple of days, finally after 2 years going back to Chicago. So I just gave her a donation and grabbed it. But by the time I had walked up the steps of that station to the street level, I was enamored by that picture of Krishna on the cover. I was fixated on it so strongly that I almost got run over by a double-decker bus. If I hadn't just looked up in time, I wouldn't have stepped back from the curb. And what was so interesting about that, where I had looked at the picture and then I'd read, Godhead is light and omniscience is darkness. When I read this very strong buzz statement that would piqued my interest, an ad was on the side of the bus, and I was nose to nose with the side of the bus, so the words were just going by, and the words read, "In your head, you know it's right." And I was like shocked. And I looked down at this picture of Krishna, happened to be that cover of Shyam Sundar. And I was already captured, visually being captured. And the idea is that when you visually you're captured through the eye, the head comes along with it. So the head has two ears, and the mind, of course. So even though I didn't know what I was getting into exactly, I knew that like a magnet, I was attracted to it. And I remember not really reading very much of that magazine. The next 3 days, I was putting my things together, and I got on a plane, and but on the plane, I read what was in the magazine. And there were different articles which I don't recall. I don't recall the substance or the content. But by the time I got through customs, I was determined even to not go home, even though I was, had been away for 2 years. I was determined before I went home, there was an address there of some place in Chicago of the Hare Krishnas, and I was determined to go check it out on the way home. Which
year was this?
1971. And of course, this was a small apartment in a very rundown part of town. And it's actually very interesting the way that I got there, because my sister was supposed to pick me up at the airport and she didn't show up. And I was left alone on at the terminal on a warm spring afternoon. And I figured I'd have to take the bus home, because she must have mixed up the day or the time. And that those days there's no cell phones. I didn't think to bother her with a phone call. So I was thinking to myself, that's a relief. That means I'm not supposed to go to that Hare Krishna place. Oh, that's over. And as I was thinking that, a girl came out of nowhere. And she comes up to me. Not very often that girls, I wasn't the kind of guy in high school or college that was, always attracted to girls. And she came up to me and says, "Do you need a ride?" And I said, "Well, actually my sister was supposed to come, but I was going to stop by this Hare Krishna place on the way home, but the bus takes me right to the door of my mother's place. So it's not necessary. And she said to me, "Oh, Hare Krishna, I've always wanted to go there. You stay here, I'll get my car, I'll take you there." So I said, "But where do you live?" And she turned out to live like 40 miles the other side of the airport. So I said, "That's completely the opposite direction." She said, that's okay, you wait here. So I'm standing there and I'm praying for that bus to come before she does. Because I'm just kind of tired of, 3 days of kind of these synchronous events taking place. And no, she comes and we drive. And by the time we get to the apartment, it's in a very rough part of Chicago. Rents are pretty cheap. So I'm very uncomfortable leaving all my luggage from 2 years in the car. So we should bring my luggage up, just to make sure it's safe. So the two of us lug all the bags up the stairs to the second floor, knock on the door, and Mataji answers the door. Mataji, she answers the door, and incense, blows out of the place. And, "Oh, Hare Krishna, come on in. We're just having Bhagavad Gita class. You're just in time." And so, kind of put the luggage in there, and I sit down, and this devotee, who I later learned his name was Parabhakacharya, he was speaking from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He was talking about how the soul is eternal, never dies, can't be cut, dissolved. All these things I never heard before. And by hearing, I was overwhelmed with relief. And I began to question within my mind, why didn't my parents tell me all this? This is so deep. This is so profound. And, by the time they finished the class and I drank the banana milk with sugar, and, I wasn't ready to go anywhere. And they offered for me to stay at the temple. I had all my stuff. The girl wanted to go home. So I called my mother and I said, I'll come home tomorrow morning. But I never did. Because
Wow.
hearing from that Bhagavad Gita directly, those verses, and then him giving some very simple explanation, convinced me that this was the highest reservoir of all knowledge. So my introduction to Srila Prabhupada's books wasn't really reading the books, but it was hearing, and not just hearing, recitation, but hearing from a devotee and hearing their realizations. So it all had context. It had the prasadam around it. It had the offering of the incense. The sense of smell was engaged. It had the friend of the sangha of the different devotees, and it had the gyan. The knowledge was there, and it just all came together like a perfect storm, and destroyed with a hurricane most of my material conceptions. And then once I began to hear from that all this knowledge was in the Gita, I drank it like a man in a drought, thirst, trying to quench his thirst. I couldn't get enough of reading the books. And that's how I got into reading Srila Prabhupada's books. Not only his books, but every time a letter would come from Srila Prabhupada, we'd all share it at the temple together. So that was also a process of hearing from Srila Prabhupada. And in much of these things, it created context, which was sorely missing in those early days, because we wouldn't have much to go on. And we would take things to their extreme. And it took many decades for me to understand that reading Srila Prabhupada's books is done in conjunction with the seva of japa, with the seva of deity worship, with the seva of book distribution, with the seva of working in the kitchen and cleaning pots or cooking, that it's all like this cauldron that, you know, if you take any one of those ingredients out, you don't get the right taste. At least that was my experience.
Quite
So
a quite a fantastic experience, I must say, Prabhu. And when you were talking about Tottenham Court Road, I smiled because that's a station, at least in the last 10 years, I would go often to visit the temple. I was curious to ask, was the temple still there? I can literally visualize, you know, they renovated the station recently, but I could literally visualize what it is walking out. You're at the junction, there's a very high chance of getting hit by a bus because there's nothing separating the road from when you step onto the pavement. And it seems that Krishna uh, first attracted you with what you were naturally attracted, the visuals. And it's, you know, it's unimaginable, the sequence of events that you just described, and that how in a matter of 4 days you were in. And attracted of the three things that you talked about: the sense of smell, the prasad, the devotees. I was wanting to add also the visuals that was naturally attracting. The mind got that huge message on that bus that was about to hit you, and it did hit you. I think the bus did hit you in a metaphorical way. Uh, I don't know if any devotee. I'm sure all devotees have had an impact, but yours was definitely quite fantastic in many ways.
that's not even the half of it. I remember walking from Tottenham Court Road over to Covent Garden to get my degree because I wanted to leave England and have my diploma. It was a master's degree in film, and so I looking around and I saw the principal, and she was carrying some papers, and I said, "Miss Dunbar, I'm looking for my degree." Oh, she says, "I have your degree right here, David. And then she hands it to me. She says, "Here's your degree from the School of Illusion." So then I left there and I went to get my ticket. In those days, you got cheap tickets at charter agencies. So I went to the charter agency office, and in the back office is the owner. And he motions me, come in. Okay. And I come into his office. He said, when I was your age, I had a very deep spiritual experience, a religious spiritual experience. He says, "You want to go to lunch? We can talk about it." I was already a vegetarian by that time. So I figured, okay, I said, "I'm a vegetarian." He says, "That's fine. Let's go." So we went and he told me his whole story of how, this was interesting, of how he missed taking up that opportunity when he was my age, and now he was stuck. He probably was 30. To me, that was anyone past 30, you don't trust in those days. But, it just went on like that for 3 days. And by the time I was at the temple, which is just an apartment, I was exhausted. I had no defenses left. Krishna really just, once I drank that banana milk with brown sugar, I was done.
And then you mentioned that you started to drink the nectar of Bhagavad Gita, and you also alluded that when the books were coming out, the letters were coming, you were continuing to drink this nectar of Srila Prabhupada's books. What was the mood like amongst others around you? Did they sort of appreciate your enthusiasm to read and absorb, or was it, "Oh, Prabhu, you're wasting too much time looking at the letters and the books, to get on with service"?
Well, no one, in those days, you just followed your authorities without much question. So no one really had the luxury of determining what they wanted to do. You were in the morning program, you were in the kitchen, you were at the press, you were at lunch, you were at Harinam in the evening, you were sometimes in book distribution, door to door in the evening. You didn't have a whole lot of time to read, but because I was at the press and because we were the first to see the finished product, it was always very exciting there. So there was some drama. But in terms of anybody restricting the time, nobody consciously would tell us, oh, no, you're reading too much, because there was too much to do just to sustain the temple and keep things going. Our Sunday feasts were huge. I was part of the Vaikuntha Players at that time, so we'd put on plays. It was a very busy period. And then Srila Prabhupada came, and of course, then everybody was fully maxed out. So reading was not a priority for anybody that I know of. It may have been for a select few, but it's interesting because Prabhupada actually states that, first health, that's what you got to take care of, number one. And then after health comes sadhana. And then after sadhana comes sadhana, then seva, then service. And believe it or not, in that list, then after that he says japa. It's really interesting. So, at least in those days, we were really fully engaged. We had many different engagements with sometimes television studios and festivals. So a lot of things were going on in those days.
Do you still read Prabhupada's books every day?
Well, I wanted to speak to that. I read them every day, but there's you had Sudapa on here the other day, and I was so impressed. I mean, they've developed such a nice systematic reading, which some devotees did by themselves. I mean, you have different mentalities of devotees. Some are much more Brahminically inclined. Listen, let's face it. I mean, okay, we're all lower than Sudra, but still, if you're in the arts, you're a Sudra. Even the artist, you're a Sudra. If you're a filmmaker, you're a Sudra. And there's certain of us that are in that profession that don't have that kind of nature that just can sit and read. There are devotees like that. And when you take something like, you've got to read Prabhupada's books, 2 hours a day, and you add that into the mix of everything else you have to do today, something has to give somewhere. So, I find it really exciting that we're pushing the idea of reading Prabhupada's books. But my experience is that it comes in waves. Sometimes in your life, that's all you want to do. You just don't want to do any external saving. You just want to absorb books. A lot of times, even when there's the books written by some of, like, Shyam Sundar's book came out, you had to read that book. It was just really exciting to read that book. And you put everything else aside just to immerse yourself in that book. So, I'll be a self-admitted, yes, sometimes I'm in that mood. Other times I'm not, but all the time I have a particular taste. And that taste is like a detective. I like to look at something that Prabhupada said, and then I like to explore it. I like to use Vanipedia to look up all the different places Prabhupada spoke about that subject or said that phrase. If you look up, let's say, take a very extreme example. I really like to explore the rape issue. There's so much controversy what Prabhupada said about the rape issue. I like to look at the verse ahead. I like, the purport ahead, the verse and the purport after. Then I like to look up all the other places, because we have the luxury of doing that now, that Prabhupada spoke to it. And then I get a full picture of it. And then I'm able to actually really, really begin, I don't say fully, but begin to understand what Prabhupada means when he makes these very controversial kinds of remarks. I'm not one that would ever be in favor of expurgating or redacting anything that Srila Prabhupada said. I would be much in favor of taking those really controversial statements and embellishing them in the Vaishnava tradition of Bhasya, because Bhasya is commentary. That's what we do. And that's what you don't, You don't change what the spiritual master has said. You give it more of a domain. You give it much more context. And that leads to a far deeper understanding. So for me, looking at Prabhupada's books, though I never had the advantage of doing a systematic, okay, here's the Bhagavatam, and I'd love to do that. I'd love to try to understand the time frame. It jumps all over the place. I get so lost sometimes when I'm reading the Bhagavatam. I don't know what millennium I'm in. I don't know what kalpa I'm in. Where did it happen? Where did I miss it? You know, I must have skipped over one line that you know, and I have to always go back. Thank God they're there to the chapter descriptions. Oh, that's okay. Nirga is like, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, Yayati, this. You know, I get a context, and I have to. And I'm also one of those people, unfortunately for me, and fortunate in one sense, that I hear something in one ear and it goes right out the other. And I'll have to hear it again and again and again and again and again. That's why it's good if you read every day, because you learn by repetition. But there are people like me, I've met them in the movement, we don't remember a lot. Now that works really well when you have bad memories of experiences. You know, someone betrays you or, you know, hurts you in some way, but you know, you don't have, you don't remember it too much. So that works. But for reading Srila Prabhupada's books and sitting on the asana, the asasan, and being able to repeat slokas and remember systematically various pastimes, oh, for some of us, that's embarrassing. So,
Well, you're being modest. You're being modest. You share so many names there from the Srimad Bhagavatam, which most people won't recall. So you definitely have good retention. But here's a bit that I heard from one of the speakers on this point, where Maharaj was glorifying, in a sense. He was saying, you know, it's in one way it's nice that we forget in Kali Yuga, because then when you go back, you feel enlivened to read again. So I
100% true. 100%. It's ever fresh. It's like if you have minds like I have, you're always living in the moment practically. You know, it's like be here now. I'm only here now. I can't remember anything from the past.
But you also touched upon a very important point about bhasya and giving context also to the statements. I would say, Prabhu, when we talk about reading books, what was discussed by some speakers, reading it systematically, one chapter after the other, is what some devotees do, and they get nourishment from that. That's one way. The others are more and more now hearing the translations and purports, for which the ministry has also arranged the complete recordings of translation purports in Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam with His Holiness Keshav Bharati Maharaj. And I have come across, like you mentioned, whereas topical study, you take up a particular topic, be it even of controversy, as you do, but then you hear from Srila Prabhupada. And all of that is, in a way, I mean, although we're calling it the week of Shravanam week, encouraging devotees to study Srila Prabhupada's books, but this is all encompassing. It is, all these elements count. Of course, in the Vanis included the letters, the morning walks, and everything, because it gives a context. So you talked about this topic about controversial statements in Srila Prabhupada's books. Not many devotees want to talk about it because it's controversial. You know, who wants to take that topic up? Devotees feel hesitant. A lot of devotees feel hesitant when they encounter certain statements in Srila Prabhupada's books, which may speak directly to them in a particular sort of a situation, in a particular sort of an ashram, varna, and so on and so forth. I'll give you my personal example, although there's a lot of hoo-ha about one controversy or the other. But for me, as a businessman, as a person who was out there being successful, earning money, making a success of one's life the way we see it, believe it or not, it was equally shattering, controversial, even more, to just know that one should not run after money. I don't know how to express it. It's like your whole existence or the whole model based upon which you lived your life and you're making a success of your life is slipped under your feet. So I want to know more from you as to why do we make it controversial? What's the big deal about all of this? Isn't every statement out there really penetrating and shaking your very existence? So what would your reflections be on this? I mean, why certain topics are more controversial than the others?
Okay, well, that becomes obvious when you have certain statements the Prabhupada makes about Negroes or Hitler or other things. These have global repercussions in terms of a yatra that some yatras like South Africa may be far more sensitive and worried about the impact of these kinds of statements taken out of context. Whereas as an individual, I look at them and then I go, oh, Prabhupada's never wrong. You have to understand, Prabhupada is never, ever wrong. He's a Mahabhagwat. And if you approach the books with the idea that, he's not saying anything that's not true. He's not saying anything he's just saying things that we don't grasp, that we don't have an experience of. Maybe it's multidimensional. Maybe it's just because of our limited, we have limited senses. But everything that Prabhupada says, when you see the whole picture, it becomes comprehensible. So a lot of devotees, frankly, are not well versed in everything Prabhupada said on these particular subjects. So it becomes very frightening, number one, for themselves, because they don't understand it completely. They don't want to accept it, that Prabhupada could say such things, because they don't have full knowledge. They haven't taken the time to really be a detective and search underneath it. And secondly, they're also working on the basis of fear. What does that mean to how we look to society? And, if there's anything that Srila Prabhupada taught, certainly us in the beginning, it's that we're going to look and be and say things that are different than the modern civilization takes as the norm. And we are presenting ourselves, our process is different, our lifestyles are different, our goal of life is different. What we base the reality on, which is the Shastras, is completely different. They base theirs on empirical sciences. We have a descending system of knowledge. So I think a lot of it is is based on these two fears. One is based on lack of full knowledge of what Prabhupada said, and the other is a worry about how it's going to be perceived by others who certainly don't have the context that we have. And I think we have to face those fears, and we have to just preach the reality that we have, according to time, place, and circumstance, and not hide anything that Srila Prabhupada has stated, in the hopes and in the faith that by doing that, Krishna will always come to our rescue.
And your proposal is that if one has a right attitude, which is one starts with the premise that Srila Prabhupada is always right, he's never wrong. If one wears that cap and goes ahead and reads Srila Prabhupada's books, call it systematically, call it topically, and with a prayerful mood to show the light, show the truth on the premise, then in your experience, you have been able to reconcile, at least, if not all, at least some of the topics that you've researched so far. Is that a summary?
Yeah. I mean, look, Prabhupada said women are less intelligent or 8 times more lusty than men. He said a lot of things that, if you take them out of context, could be very offensive. And our job is to put them into context. And that's where we need to bone up on the books and become familiar, study these subjects. And we may sometimes do that and have differences of opinion. There's those that believe, for example, very strongly that no women should become gurus, and there are those that say no. Prabhupada says here, the women, all of his disciples, men and women, should become gurus. And we have diversity even within the society itself. So there's a lot we haven't even come to the point where we agree on everything, and we never will. So to try to make everybody follow the same pattern, I think is not really dealing with reality. Reality is we're all very, very different, and we're going to understand things differently and in our own good time. And the basis for doing that is really hearing from Srila Prabhupada. We say reading his books. My wife listens to lectures all day long. English is not her first language, but she listens a lot to Russian lectures, translations of Prabhupada's lectures, and lectures of some, of our sadhus in our movement. She's much more tuned to hearing. It's how she accepts information, and she's not as attached to reading. But it's all hearing. It's all shravana. So, I think we have to kind of expand our understanding of what it means to read Srila Prabhupada's books. It means to hear from Srila Prabhupada. And that's the grander context of hearing and reading.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. And as long as what's being spoken by the sadhus is from the books of Srila Prabhupada referring to the Bhaktivedanta purport, then it's all the same. It's just embellished more by their personal realizations as well.
I'm a cherry picker. I find those devotees that are really giving it as it is, and I accept those into my life, and I reject those that are kind of fudging it a little bit. You have to use your discrimination. Prabhupada gave us that instruction that he wanted us to be independently thoughtful. And it doesn't mean that, someone who's important to another person is going to be as important to us. We're each individuals. So, it's a very individual path. And studying the books is very individual. I was thinking it's really interesting because you sometimes when people just get a Gita, I'll say to them, just read the introduction. The introduction will set the whole scene for you. It's a magnificent work that Srila Prabhupada put together. It's one of the best, you'll find it one of the best summaries, beautifully and eloquently written by any spiritual preceptor. And I'll think to myself, Nrsimhananda, you never read that introduction when you started reading Bhagavad Gita. We do learn things as we go along that might be actually better, but you have to find your own way, and that has to be respected, I think, so that each one of us feels good about ourselves, feels good about, well, I may not be the best scholar, but I sure love kirtan. I sure love chanting. I sure love japa. We all have our strengths. We all have those areas that we're going to be attracted to more than others. And it won't be the same for everybody. That's really important.
So far in our conversation, you've touched upon, at least in the last conversation that we talked about with respect to differences of opinion, etc. You've touched upon generally the importance for ISKCON as a movement to grow and possibly grow together amongst all devotees if we were to hear and read and understand what's given in Srila Prabhupada's books. You also, in the first part of our conversation, you also touched upon its impact in your formative years of Krishna consciousness and its impact on how it's keeping you nourished individually. I want to ask you a question with respect to leaders and managers. You're obviously a very busy person in terms of your life with your various services, as the chair of the Sabha, and many other things that you do for ISKCON and otherwise outside in your life. What message can you give to the leaders or the managers with respect to reading Prabhupada's books and prioritizing reading Prabhupada's books in their lives, and its relationship to how we conduct ourselves in our managerial services, in our leadership services? If you could please share some words on that.
Okay. I mean, I'm not really in a position to tell, other of my god brothers and god sisters how to read. As I've been saying, it's such an individual process, and how much to read. There are some days, and I do want to touch on this, that I will.
I want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I rephrase my question. So it's not about you speaking to senior members of ISKCON and telling them how much to read or what to read. I'm requesting you to speak to the next generation, having gone through your 50 years of Krishna consciousness, the next generation, which is coming in as leaders, as managers, temple presidents. If you can speak to them and share what is in it that we really need to pay attention, because everybody gets overwhelmed with the number of services they have.
All right. Let's put it like this. Reading is like eating a good meal. You're reading Prabhupada's books. I mean, there is a lot there to digest. And some of it is so heady and heavy that it takes a little time. Just like when you eat so much prasad or rich prasad, it takes time to digest it. So sometimes you have to just sit with stuff. You may have to even change subjects. You may have to just take time and be able to process. And that's not very well regarded or understood, but it's a really important part of staying healthy in spiritual life. After you eat a good meal, you're supposed to relax, let your body, digest it very peacefully. So I think the same has to be there when we study Prabhupada's books. There are days that I'll read things, or I'll usually be in search of understanding something, and I'll be kind of in this deep detective search for, what is that? What is aggressive? What's the meaning of aggressive in that context? And I'll look things up even beyond what's in Prabhupada's books to get an understanding, because there was one really great story about how there was a word in Sanskrit that was debated that Prabhupada translated it wrong. But actually, when they went back to a 16th century dictionary, there it was exactly as Prabhupada had translated it. And of course, Prabhupada translates things also not exactly. He translates things for mood and for feeling. It's a very sentient translation that Prabhupada's given us. So we have to enter into that also. And sometimes he translates for drama to give us impetus to read on. So that kind of takes some time. I mean, it's not everybody that can go to Govardhan and sit and just, it's a nice thing. Vaisesika does this, and I think it's a really smart thing. He takes that time out and goes to Govardhan and just sits with it, reads and sits with it. And we don't have enough time just sitting with it because we're too busy. And I think that in many ways, if there's anything I've learned in all these years, it's to take the time to consider, take the time just to allow the information to process by itself without my intervention. And I think that will solve a lot of our quote unquote differences, because you get to a different level of understanding, and you also understand that there are different ways of understanding things, and different mentalities that look at things in different ways. It's like a husband and a wife. When they speak to each other, there's always this question of, how can you communicate best? And sometimes you have to spell it out to the other person because they don't know what you're talking about and they're confused. And you always do that. And can't you tell me from the beginning? And, reading Prabhupada's books is a conversation with Prabhupada. It's a love letter from Prabhupada to you. It's pregnant with a lot of emotional, spiritual emotion. And if you just read it like breeze by it a lot, or just read too much, it's not digestible. So I think that, sometimes less is more. Sometimes not reading for 1 hour, but thinking about what you've read, for a half an hour after reading for half an hour makes a lot of sense. It just depends on the individual. And I'm just afraid that we get into these wonderful catchphrases of let's say, what was the latest one? Was from Vaisesika. He has this program going on now that I forget the name of it, but sometimes we just get into these ideas that the shoe doesn't quite fit. And that's okay. We have to put on a different shoe sometimes.
Very, very interesting perspective, Prabhu. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody who's going to view this interview will learn a lot. This conversation.
Can I touch on one more point?
Yes, please.
So, one devotee said one time that the most dangerous words spoken were Prabhupada said. Most dangerous words in ISKCON. And in some ways, that's very, very true. Because they're all out of context. Prabhupada, for example, said, never leave ISKCON. And, where did he say that? Where's that transcribed? What did that come from? And Giriraj Maharaj, he said that he had asked Srila Prabhupada, now you are here, so everything's all right. But what if in the course of time, when you're not here, ISKCON falls from the standard? What should I do? And Prabhupada replied, according to his memory, you are also one of the important members of the society. So you work for the correction, but don't leave. So that's a little different than never leave ISKCON, because it really, it's a very personal question, and he addresses Giriraj as an important leader, and it's subtle nuances, but it makes so much difference in our understanding. And I think that we have to always think about when we hear various statements from Srila Prabhupada that, the idea is, well, let me look more deeply into that. There's many other statements. Show your love for me by how you cooperate, or, whether there's sinful reactions in the mind or not experienced in the Kali Yuga. He said things about which was going to be the first Krishna conscious country. The law books for the next 10,000 years. There are many things that we have Prabhupada said, but you've got to look into them and see the context for how he spoke these things.
I would definitely have to come back to you for another part 2, or maybe part 3 and part 4 of this conversation. Nrsimhananda Prabhu. There are many, many important takeaways from what you spoke today. The one that we kept coming back to in hearing from you was to make sure that we understand the context, that whatever we're reading, we should meditate on it, absorb it, try to get the overall context to be able to really appreciate what that reading or hearing, that instruction is meant for. I'm thankful and grateful for your time today, Nrsimhananda Prabhu. I hope that we will have another opportunity to hear more and discuss more on this very important topic of reading, hearing from Srila Prabhupada every day and its importance in our life. Thank you again for your time. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. All glories to Srila Prabhupada's transcendental books. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyo cha patitanam pavnebhyo vaishnavibhyo namo namaha.
Hare Krishna